As the American troops wind up their military operations in Afghanistan, China has emerged as the leading international player keen on stabilizing Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan. In recent years, China has over the last year, China has taken a leading role in pushing reconciliation between the Taliban and Afghan government, and has also brought together Afghanistan and Pakistan, who had a historically acrimonious relationship. In today's edition of RFE RLive, we are lucky to have Andrew Small of the German Marshall Fund and Barnett Rubin of the Center for International Cooperation at New York University. They're two leading scholars who who regularly go to China and are kind of different from other academics in terms of going to the field a lot and knowing some of the actors involved in these discussions in the diplomatic side of things, and also the scholars in these countries. Andrew Small has recently published a book called The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. And Barnett Rubin has been involved, among other things, with the State Department, Office of Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He was the lead figure behind the whole Afghan reconciliation effort. It will be fair to say that he conceived and shaped this program for an intra-Afghan reconciliation, which now appears to be the key piece of future Afghan peace process, or the ongoing Afghan peace process. There will be more accurate characterization of what is happening now. So to begin with, I will ask Barney that, I mean, you have been involved in this effort until quite recently in an official capacity, and you still lead this China-United States Forum on Afghanistan, if I'm right. In your view, how China became interested in Afghanistan? What were its domestic compulsions, and were there any leadership changes in China that prompted a more active role on their part, leaving behind the traditional policy of non-interference?
Well, thanks a lot, Abubakar, and thank you for organizing this. And it's very good to be here with Andrew, and I highly recommend his book to anyone who is listening and is interested in this subject. I think both China and I would like to demur a little bit from the way you have characterized our role. I wouldn't say that, I don't want to be on the record as saying that I shaped or formed the policy. I participated in it, but the policy is now firmly in the hands of the Afghan government. Perhaps some of the preliminary work we did will facilitate that. And China, I have found, very much does not want to be described as taking the lead and emerging as the main power responsible for stabilizing Afghanistan and Pakistan. They prefer to say that they would like to have a partnership with the United States in order to do that. Nonetheless, compared to their previous policies, which were relatively passive, wait and see, and focused solely on their internal politics, they have become remarkably more active. What happened was, and this is something which is not unique to China, all the countries in the area, the neighbors of Afghanistan, both the near countries and the far countries, and also the political actors in Afghanistan, were waiting to see what decision the United States would make about its troop presence, and before they decided on their future course of action. And finally, it became clear to China and to other neighbors that yes, President Obama was really serious about withdrawing the American troops from Afghanistan, and he was going to end that combat role and ultimately the military presence. And that meant they then faced a difficult choice. Do they want to try to, I won't say fill the vacuum, because the United States will continue giving aid and so on, or will they become more active in some way? Now, China decided to become much more active, primarily, it hopes, in partnership with the United States. for a number of reasons. Fundamentally, China has now become a global economic power, and that means that it has now started to recognize that it has interests in the international system as a whole, and especially in the regions around it, like any other great power, and having stability so that markets can operate and people can have the confidence to invest and so on. Second, and Andrew knows much more about this than I, he can perhaps elaborate on this, the Chinese development strategy internally has changed in that it was based on rapid growth of exports based in coastal cities. And now that is reaching kind of a saturation point, and they have instead started an effort to industrialize the interior and the west of China. And in fact, we do hear about ethnic conflict in Xinjiang. One thing I learned from Andrew's book that I didn't know before was that the economic growth rate in Xinjiang has been very high, on the order of 10% a year since China started those investments. Therefore, China now has a strong interest in stability in Central Asia and also in Pakistan and in Afghanistan because of its need for a supportive security environment for its economic growth. In addition, the increased investment in Western China has led to an influx of ethnic Chinese from other parts of the country, massive construction in traditionally Uyghur areas, change in the demographic balance, and all this has led to rising ethnic conflict. And, of course, there's a small number of people from that area who have undergone militant training in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there have been some acts of terrorism committed within China as a perhaps not as a result, but in connection with that movement. And therefore, China is very concerned that the instability of Afghanistan will in turn have an impact on the domestic stability of China. For all these reasons, it decided to take a much larger role.
Before I go to Andrew, I just want to remind our viewers, some of them are live, watching us live right now. I would like to remind them that they can also participate in this discussion by sending us questions through Twitter and through Facebook. Andrew, one of the things that Barney perhaps didn't elaborate on was this Uyghur issue. I mean, the Uyghurs are a predominantly Muslim ethnic group that is mostly concentrated in northwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang. In your view, how big is the security threat this Uyghur group, separatist group or Islamist group, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement pose, and how and is that the main motivation behind China's efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Okay, well, thank you, first of all, very much, Abubakar, for having me on, and thanks, Bonnie, for the nice comments about the book, too. On this question, I think you have to separate out a few different elements. How direct a cross-border threat, for instance, is ETIM? How anxious is the Chinese government about the role that what is a relatively small group plays? And what are the real underlying issues in terms of terrorism threats in Xinjiang? Because I think you actually get some quite different answers to those questions. The situation in Xinjiang, you went virtually a decade without there being any major terrorist attacks, and then in the period that was from the late 90s to about 2008, and in the period since 2008, there has clearly been an escalation of incidents taking place initially in Xinjiang, but then in more recent period, particularly in the last couple of years, incidents outside Xinjiang as well, in major Chinese cities, in Beijing, in Kunming. There is clearly an escalating problem in terms of the terrorist threat emanating from that region. Now, this has, of course, made the Chinese government anxious and anxious about the threats emanating from within Xinjiang, but in terms of the international influence that exists there as well. The question of whether this, what is really a very small group, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, perhaps numbers only tens of people. I think it's difficult to suggest that their direct involvement in some of these incidents in Xinjiang or in the major Chinese cities outside Xinjiang is very clear. There are always attempts on the Chinese side to pin this on an international terrorist threat. It's quite difficult to trace the direct linkage, whether it's in terms of training or personnel or these sorts of things. Nonetheless, I think China's grown concerned at least about the ideological influence that has come from a group that has largely been based in North Waziristan in the last period of time, and that translates in Chinese foreign policy into more of an effort to try to put pressure on regional governments to stamp out the threat, and to more worries about safe havens existing for these for this group in Afghanistan over the longer period of time, as happened during Taliban rule in the late 90s. And the anxiety levels about this group are not necessarily directly commensurate with the threat they pose. It's a small number of people. The direct linkages are relatively thin, but they do put out propaganda material, and I think the Chinese view among counterterrorism experts is still you're better to stamp out a relatively small threat that could potentially escalate than be sanguine about the fact that this group's operational capacity is not necessarily very high.
Barney, I mean, being in the State Department in recent years, we have seen a mixed record at best of Islamabad cooperating with Washington. I mean, Osama bin Laden was famously found in Abbottabad, but in the case of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, we have seen that the Pakistanis are very keen on moving on Chinese requests to kill or capture ETIM members. In 2003, the first ETIM leader, Muhammad Mahsoum, was killed in Waziristan. And then I think in 2009, another leader of this group, Abdul Haq Turkestani, was also killed in North Waziristan. So in your view, is there some incentive that China is offering Pakistan that perhaps the West was not offering to go after this group?
Well, I think, Andrew, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that most of the ETIM leaders killed in Pakistan were actually killed by American drones.
Yes.
Right? Yes, they were not killed by Pakistanis. Pakistan has a quite spotty record of managing to control all the terrorist groups on its territory, including ETIM. Though from time to time they have made an effort, in particular in the current offensive that started in North Waziristan, ETIM appeared to be the first target. But China has been quietly dissatisfied with Pakistan's counterterrorism performance, including against ETIM, for many years. That's one of the reasons that it has moved to diversify its relations in the region. But the big thing that has changed now is actually from the side of Afghanistan, because President Ashraf Ghani visited Pakistan in November. I was just in Pakistan about 10 days ago. Andrew and I were there together, actually. And somehow, in a very short period of time, he effectuated a quite radical change in Pakistani attitudes toward Afghanistan. And the mood there now is much more toward cooperation, and a feeling that under President Ghani, Afghanistan is not a threat to Pakistan, but will be a partner, and therefore the government is much more inclined to cooperate on all sorts of counterterrorism measures. But even as we see in the case of China, where they were willing to cooperate, we don't know how good their capacity is.
And just a follow-up question precisely on this issue. The New York Times, I think, was the first to report late last year that the Afghans were cooperating with the Chinese by providing access to captured Uyghur militants, Uyghur militants that they had captured on inside Afghanistan, and of course most of these were coming from across the border in Pakistan. And that has kind of changed Beijing's views about Afghanistan, because we know that historically Beijing has been indifferent to the various wars in Afghanistan, including after 9/11.
Well, I would put it a little differently because China didn't become interested in Afghanistan after the government arrested and handed over those Uyghurs that it found in Afghanistan. It already was interested because it was very much aware of the potential threat, and also, let's not forget, it has big plans for investment in the region, and it needs stability in order to make those investments possible. What happened was more that at a certain point where that cooperation was maturing, I don't know exactly how the timing worked, but Afghanistan handed over a group of Uyghurs to China as a continuing part of the confidence building between the two countries. I might note, by the way, that the United States does not hand over Uyghur detainees to China. We have transferred some out of Guantanamo, but we won't return them to China for fear that they might be tortured or executed, and they have gone to other places like Bermuda.
Andrew, on Western cooperation, I mean, we know that the international effort in Afghanistan was sort of a coalition of the willing, primarily European countries, United States, and other allies, NATO allies. How are these countries, particularly Washington, viewing China's role, current role and future role in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
I mean, on Afghanistan, I think there's been a long-term effort to encourage China to play a more expansive role there. The degree to which China is now willing to step up on the diplomatic front and potentially in future on the economic front as well is something that has been very actively encouraged. I mean, in almost every dimension of China's role in the country, there have been attempts on both the European front and on the US front to solicit a more active Chinese role. The fact that China was playing such a back seat, took such a back seat in the period after 9/11 for most of the last decade was seen as a disappointment for some time. So I'd say the expanded role that China's taking on now on this front is being seen in almost exclusively positive terms. But one of the major aspects of it, though, was always could you get China to play a role in dealing with the Pakistanis, in encouraging, in taking advantage of the special relationship between the two sides, to push Pakistan towards playing a more constructive role. That's one of the elements, even more so than the direct political, diplomatic, and economic involvement that I think has been seen as one of the crucial roles that China can play in bringing stability to the region. And there are some indications at the moment that it has been willing to lean in more actively with its Pakistani friends. Of course, I think if China was willing to play a more expansive economic role, this would be crucial to the Afghan government's capacity to generate revenues. The special role that China could potentially play in some of these reconciliation talks, given that it's a relatively neutral party, that it's relatively trusted by most of the sides involved in the conflict, it's helpful. But I think the relationship with Pakistan has tended to be seen as one of the most important elements which, if leveraged, could really make a difference.
And Barney, tied to this question is the fact that until a couple years ago, I used to hear from Chinese officials in conferences in Europe or other parts of the world that they would publicly say that their policy for Afghanistan is to support Pakistan's policy in Afghanistan. Do you think that has changed, and to what extent has that policy changed?
Actually, I've never heard a Chinese official say that. Perhaps because of when I started being involved with them, the Chinese officials, without ever saying anything against Pakistan at a public meeting, or even rarely in private with Americans, has clearly defined its own policy toward Afghanistan, which is separate from Pakistan. It has its own bilateral relations with Afghanistan, and it recognizes that Chinese and Pakistani interests are not exactly the same. In fact, I have had Chinese scholars who are very close to the government say to me that China will not permit Pakistan to do something that is against the national interest of China. Bear in mind that Pakistan is very important for China because just by being there, it distracts India and makes India less of a competitor on the world stage. So that's important for China's overall global strategy. Therefore, in that sense, China needs Pakistan. But Pakistan also very much needs China because the actual absolute centerpiece of Pakistan's defense strategy right now is its nuclear weapons. Because it cannot, it can in no way can it have parity with India in conventional forces. It's impossible. And of course, it has this capacity to use terrorists and asymmetrical forces as well, but those could lead to a very severe conventional response by India, which didn't happen after the attacks in Mumbai, largely because of the nuclear weapons that Pakistan has. So and China is the only country virtually that has given Pakistan that assistance. So that is absolutely crucial for Pakistan. So China cannot control Pakistan, but definitely Pakistan cannot afford to do something that China identifies as contrary to its national interests. And that has an effect on Pakistan's calculus.
Well, Andrew has written a lot about the Chinese-Pakistani nuclear cooperation and defense cooperation. We will move to that. But first, let me bring you on another issue, the central issue that we want to touch on today. Andrew, you mentioned that China is interested in that the world at large, particularly Western nations, United States and its allies, are keen on China, in a sense, leaning on Pakistan, and by doing so, it wants to encourage Pakistan to bring the Afghan Taliban to the negotiation table to, in a sense, help the Afghan peace process, the reconciliation among Afghans. And this month in particular is really crucial because the reports that we have seen recently suggest that there is a lot of behind the scenes diplomatic activity going on. Senior Afghan officials are right now in Qatar. A few days ago there were reports that Mullah Omar has sanctioned, the Taliban fugitive leader, has sanctioned talks with the Afghan government for the first time, although the Taliban later denied those reports. So in your sense, how much progress the Chinese diplomatic initiative or involvement has actually made in realizing or bringing reconciliations among Afghan forward?
I think, as Barney noted in one of the earlier comments, the most important thing has clearly been the relationship between the new Afghan government under Ashraf Ghani and the Pakistanis. That's been evidently the most crucial factor in creating the space for this effort to be possible. And I think when looking at the Chinese involvement in this, there is the question of its direct contacts with the Taliban and the particular relationship that it's had with them over time, and the particular diplomatic role that China can play on Afghanistan. But when it comes to Pakistan, there's partly this question of leaning and pressure, but there is also a question of reassurance. In terms of the China pushing Pakistan to play a role that it would be otherwise unwilling to take, pushing Pakistan to play a role that is contrary to what it perceives to be its strategic interests, I still think that would be a very difficult ask. What you're talking about at the moment is, can China's nudging and the greater interest that China is now taking in Afghanistan play a role partly in pushing Pakistan in a direction that it was already moving towards in certain respects, and can China play a reassuring role if China is one of the the lead diplomatic actors in helping to forge a future political settlement in Afghanistan? Does this provide a level of reassurance for Pakistan about how its interests will be looked after versus a number of other conceivable actors that you might think of? And I think the role has to be seen in both lights. There's an element of pressure that's clearly there on Pakistan from the Chinese side. I think there are outcomes there that China's made quite clear to Pakistan that it doesn't want to see, but Pakistan also benefits clearly from having a country that has been traditionally its closest friend in the region play this enlarged role in some of these diplomatic processes too.
Barney, one of the things that Andrew pointed out, this diplomatic breakthrough or improving relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan, although a lot of people still have very strong doubts about that kind of a breakthrough. But how far is China involved in bringing this about? We saw last year that Ashraf Ghani first went to China and then he followed up, he then went to Islamabad. So is Beijing now essentially bringing these two countries together and particularly helping with the Afghan reconciliation?
I think that would be a considerable overstatement. It's more that, as Andrew said, President Ghani has decided that he needs cooperation with Pakistan. That Pakistan military's views about terrorism have changed because of the domestic challenge to them from the Pakistani Taliban and other ultra-militant groups. And China provides a venue and a convener that is relatively trusted by both Afghanistan and Pakistan. So China can facilitate that, but it could not have made it happen by itself. In addition, for any agreement to hold, it has to be backed up by economics. That is, demobilized fighters need jobs, the economy and the state of both Afghanistan and Pakistan need to be able to support themselves, and China, along with India actually, is one of the major economic powers in the region that can provide the economic attraction that gives people an incentive to overcome mistrust and conflict.
And if I could just add to that, actually, I mean, I think it is notable that in the understanding that we have of a lot of the talks that have taken place directly between China and the Taliban, the economic component has weighed quite heavily in terms of a portion of what those discussions have addressed. And the fact that China is one of the only actors that has the resources to put in a sense, can kind of provide almost a peace dividend for Afghanistan, I think is extremely important to the future role that it can play, even if it's very hesitant about making some of these investments in the short term.
Bernie, precisely on the Chinese relations with the Taliban, do you think that the Taliban trusts them as an honest broker? Because we know that they have been talking to the Taliban. The Taliban have visited Beijing, but the Chinese diplomats have been meeting them in Pakistan and in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, first about trust in general. One of the things I learned from going from years in academia to working in government is that there's no trust in international relations. You know, nobody really trusts anybody. I'm sure Pakistan doesn't even really trust China. The level of mistrust has to be seen to be believed, and that's why they negotiate for hours and hours over language and silly documents. However, Taliban know that China is close to their historic supporter, Pakistan. China has never engaged in any kind of hostilities with the Taliban. When the Taliban were controlling most of Afghanistan, China didn't recognize their government. Only Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia did that. But Pakistan supported the sanctions against the Taliban that were passed in the UN Security Council. but it did not ostracize them to the same extent, maintained a low level of bilateral contact. So China is in the position of, on the one hand, being relatively trusted by both Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also being seen by the Taliban as Andrew said, relatively neutral. That is, it has never been in hostile combat with the Taliban and has kept channels open, while at the same time, the United States trusts, relatively speaking, China's anti-terrorist credentials. Therefore, China is acceptable to the Afghan government, Pakistan government, United States, and the Taliban.
But don't you think that, after all, Beijing is going after its own domestic Taliban, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, who are very similar in the sense that they are also a Sunni extremist Islamist group or hardline Sunni group. So don't you think that it's ultimately they would not like to restore Taliban to power in Afghanistan or to push them towards major power sharing in Afghanistan? Maybe they would like the Taliban to abandon violence and in that sense deny refuge and sanctuary to the ETIM. But don't you think that Beijing will ultimately not be interested in seeing them as part of future Afghan government?
Absolutely. I think that, I'll just say briefly, I think a red line for the Chinese is Taliban control of the central government in Afghanistan. They do not want that. But they would like to see the Taliban demobilized militarily and integrated into the Afghan political system in a way that would be compatible with the national interests of Pakistan.
Andrew, moving on to a new topic, we have mentioned economy in this conversation a lot in the discussion today. And we know for sure that China is one of the leading investors in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in addition, it has these grand economic plans, if you can call them, that for transforming its near neighborhood. But we have also seen that despite investing in Afghan mining, for instance, a lot is not happening in Afghanistan. The Ainak copper mine, there is not no real excavation going on. There's still a lot of discussions about the Chinese coming and digging copper up, but nothing much is happening in that sense. So how, in your view, is China, is economy the main incentive here for China?
Well, not in Afghanistan. I would say the role of Afghanistan in terms of China's economic plans, a lot of the in one way it's also not entirely accurate to say that China is the largest investor in Afghanistan, because although the numbers are high, if these plans were actually to be realized, as you note, in practice the sums of money that have gone into something like Ainak are comparatively modest. On most of the existing economic plans, initiatives that China has in Afghanistan, it's quite hard to see progress on them in the short term. Now, what the new Afghan government has done is try to emphasize some of the kind of new cross-border projects that might connect Afghanistan up to some of the initiatives that China is willing to press ahead with. In the case of Pakistan. With Pakistan, it certainly is the case that although there are a number of economic challenges for the proposals there, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, China is clearly willing to move ahead with them despite some of the security and political obstacles that are there at the moment. And it is undoubtedly the case that looking beyond Afghanistan proper to the wider region, there is the initiatives, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Silk Road Maritime Belt are a really major new effort on China's part to not just look at how to provide stability to its western periphery, but to connect China through a series of land corridors and maritime corridors to its principal markets and its principal energy suppliers. This has broader implications beyond any of the specific economic projects that are there, and it means that when China worries about security in Afghanistan, it doesn't worry about it just in terms of Xinjiang, doesn't worry about it just in terms of its investments in the country. It worries about its impact on the stability of the wider region, and some of these much more ambitious plans that it has spanning Eurasia. Now, even the Pakistan plans, there are challenges that exist at the moment.
We'll go to the challenges, but before we do that, I just want you to explain for our viewers what exactly is this Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative and the Pakistan-China Economic Corridor.
So the Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative is an initiative that's come about since Xi Jinping came into office to connect particularly China's western regions, but a number of central cities as well in China, all the way through by a series of land routes to major Chinese markets and major Chinese energy suppliers. When the Chinese government issues these maps, these are roads, railways, pipeline connections going through Central Asia, Southwest Asia, through to the Middle East, and all the way through to a series of sort of endpoints in Europe. It's an extremely ambitious plan that also involves a major financing fund of $40 billion. This is a set of initiatives that in some ways draws on some pre-existing plans that China has, but a number of these things are a number of these initiatives are to think this kind of grand-scale economic planning through in a much more strategic way. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is supposed to be a kind of sub-plan of the Silk Road Economic Belt. It's an initiative between China and Pakistan to connect, in particular, Xinjiang through to the Indian Ocean and the port at Gwadar. But in China's conception, as they sometimes say, all of Pakistan is a corridor. There's a whole series of interconnectivity projects in Pakistan that are partly about the direct road and rail links and these sorts of things, but are also about pumping resources into Pakistan in order to help bring about some degree of economic benefit to the country. And a lot of these plans are not just economically conceived, they're about stabilizing countries in China's periphery as well.
Barney, on this issue, we have seen in recent months in Pakistan that the Chinese, the Pakistan-China Economic Corridor has pretty much divided Pakistan. We have seen a lot of protests in the two, if you could call them, minority provinces of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, where most political parties, and they include also the Islamist political parties, are up in arms against plans to, in their view, what they're claiming, they're saying that the Punjab, the eastern province of Punjab, which is the home province of Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, and which is, of course, the dominant province in Pakistan in terms of most of Pakistani population lives in Punjab, and Punjab dominates Pakistani national institutions, particularly the military, and also it also dominates the Pakistani National Assembly because most members come from Punjab. So the minority politicians from Balochistan and Pakhtunkhwa are claiming that Punjab is diverting this economic route from these, what they call the underdeveloped Pashtun and Baloch regions to relatively prosperous regions of Punjab, because Islamabad is telling Beijing that these are insecure areas, and at least for the moment, unless you realize all these big plans and build this future road and rail networks, you can begin with this route. And it is a very big controversy, and in Pakistan we have famously seen that one major dam turned into this kind of inter-provincial issue, and that dam was never built to some provinces. It's still a big no-no. We know that there is an active separatist insurgency, but precisely if you would focus on how Beijing is seeing or is able to deal with these divisions within Pakistan over Chinese investments.
Well, I think first there's a general issue, which is many people kind of simplistically think that if deprivation is associated with conflict, then investment and economic growth will help relieve conflict. But that is very often not the case. Very often what happens is when there is a new resource or investment in an area that is relatively deprived, it intensifies conflict over who will enjoy the benefits of that resource. And we have seen that, for instance, with the development of natural gas at the port of Gwadar in Balochistan. That has been one of the factors that has led to the revival of the Baloch insurgency, nationalist insurgency there. So similarly, in this case, I think that primarily on technical grounds, because it was shorter and more direct, the Chinese had planned to run this corridor through Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, down to Gwadar, which is in Balochistan. And of course, the fact that it was going through these relatively deprived provinces theoretically could also be positive. It would have an impact on stabilizing unstable areas. I don't know exactly why the Pakistani government, what the real reason is that they decided to propose this change to route it more through Punjab. You know, they could make a plausible argument that Punjab is more secure, and others could make a plausible argument that Punjab is the political base of Nawaz Sharif, and therefore he wants to do something that will benefit his constituents. In any case, I dare say that the Chinese, whose foreign policy tries to adhere strictly to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, including Pakistan, the Chinese are quite eager not to be involved in intra-provincial and intra-ethnic conflict in Pakistan, and will hope that the Pakistan government can settle these.
Andrew, your take on this, given that at least one Pakistani Islamist politician, interestingly, said that he's going to visit Beijing and, in a sense, lobby the Chinese government for this corridor to go through Pashtunkhwa and Balochistan. Your sense, it was Maulana Fazlur Rahman, of course. So, in your view, I mean, do the Chinese have a preferred route here? Because apparently there is a lot of misinformation about this issue in Pakistan, and with your insights, I think it will be very useful to our viewers.
First of all, I think China wants to see this politically settled in a way that doesn't embroil it in a controversy. I think this even plays into questions like when Xi Jinping will visit the country. I think they want to see these issues settled and resolved in a way that is politically acceptable to all of the different parties. It's been crucial to China's relationship with Pakistan that it doesn't have that it isn't. That it has good relations with all the parties in the country, and if that looks as if it's turning into a problem, they will expect these things to be fixed. So I would expect, in terms of where they'll come out on this, that they will try to reach some sort of a solution, and will expect the Pakistani government to reach some sort of solution that accommodates these concerns. This line that I mentioned, all of Pakistan is a corridor, is quite reflective of their thinking. They don't really see this as just a single road route connecting 2 points, and I think they see some of that element of thinking as a slightly mistaken way of thinking about what they're trying to do there. As far as they're concerned, I think they'd be happy to see multiple routes that include upgrading a lot of the existing infrastructure. And I mean, just to add, some of these I mean, the road links in particular are credible short to medium term projects that I think can be expected to be realized. Some of the more ambitious things, the pipelines, the railway lines, things like that, that may be some way down the line. So when you're looking at which of these routes actually gets developed, if you're talking about constructing and upgrading particular elements of road infrastructure in Pakistan, there's no reason why that can't be done across multiple routes. Now, it is true that the original route through Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and through to Balochistan was the kind of the corridor route that had been agreed initially between the Pakistani government and the Chinese government. But my expectation is that yes, they will have security concerns about some of these routes, and yes, the current government, the Nawaz Sharif government, is certainly encouraging a particular route that benefits the Punjab. But I think China will not move ahead with any of these plans if they think they're going to cause them political difficulties in Pakistan.
Barney, you mentioned Balochistan. We have seen that Balochistan has turned into quite an insecure region for the Chinese. They have major investments in mining there again, and they have, of course, developed this Gwadar port. And Balochistan is central to their future, I mean, linking Western China to the Arabian Sea. But the Baluch nationalists also view China very negatively. Do you see them getting more involved in Balochistan politically? Of course, economically, they are a major player there.
I would imagine, based on what I know about Chinese mode of operation, that they will work very hard to avoid being involved in Balochistan politically, but they will quietly encourage the government of Pakistan to settle the conflict. And if they can play some small role in doing that, fine. I might mention Balochistan is also a focus of regional competition because because Pakistan and China, the corridor is a north-south route. India and Iran and Afghanistan recently signed a major agreement to invest in an east-west route because India doesn't have direct land access to Afghanistan now because Pakistan blocks it, but it has access to Afghanistan through the Persian Gulf, the Iranian port of Charbahar, and a road that India is building from the Afghan-Iranian border to the main ring road. So fighters have been coming out of Balochistan and attacking the Indian teams working on that road. And of course, sometimes it's attributed to the Taliban, but I think the Indians think it's not really the Taliban, it's people working for Pakistan. So Balochistan is a very key thing. And if, as the Chinese say, ultimately they're not trying to push India out, they think India also has a role in Afghanistan, and they would like these regional investments they're making to be beneficial to all countries there, including to India, which is a very difficult thing to convince Indians of, then they will also have to calm some of the Indian concerns and the Afghan concerns about Balochistan.
Well, we are running out of time. Let me ask you one last question, both of you, about the future of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Chinese role in that. Barney, first of all, are we likely to see direct negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban in the next couple months because of the Chinese diplomatic initiative or the diplomatic initiative that they had launched for the past year or so?
Really, I don't know, but it's possible that the change in the configuration of interests may force the Taliban into a direct meeting with the Afghan government earlier than they would have liked, because I believe their internal plan was to fight through this year and see to what extent they could weaken the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces, and to what extent they might be weakened internally, and then reevaluate whether to talk afterwards. The key thing, actually, that I would look for, which will make a real difference to the future, is whether Pakistan actively tries to hamper the Taliban's upcoming spring offensive, because many of the Taliban go back to Pakistan in the winter to rest and recuperate when it's cold and snowy in Afghanistan. And then they have, in the spring, it has to do with the timing of the opium harvest too. In the spring, they mobilize more people to come back and start an offensive, and every year they give this offensive some kind of religious name. Now, if Pakistan succeeds through military or police action or political action in reducing the scope of that offensive, which actually has been increasing each year, then that will be a sign that it's very serious about a political settlement, because it will be reducing the leverage of the Taliban.
And Andrew, what are we likely to see in terms of Afghanistan and Pakistan getting closer and improving their bilateral relations, and the Chinese role in that, and also again on reconciliation within Afghanistan in the next few years?
I think both Afghanistan and Pakistan benefit from a greater level of Chinese involvement diplomatically and economically at the moment. Both sides see some advantage and some kind of play in having a more active and involved Chinese role, and at the moment, at least, China has been reluctant in a sense to take on this expanded role in the region, but it's seen it as necessary to secure its interests, and you've seen over the last few years a very clear trajectory in terms of where China has been headed in terms of its willingness to take some of these heightened political responsibilities on in a way that it never was before. I think some parts of this will move more slowly than others. I think there are some of the economic initiatives where there are some huge headline figures being talked about. I think there could be some disappointments in the short term in terms of what's actually realized on that front. But I think you are going to see China playing a much more expansive political and diplomatic role than it ever has in this region before. And in the medium term, I think you're going to see a level of Chinese economic involvement in the region that is on a scale of many multiples of what it was before, provided some of these political issues can be settled to some degree. And in Pakistan, I think even if some of these political issues are not settled to some degree. So I think the trajectory on this front at the moment is quite clear.
Well, Andrew and Barney, thanks for the informative and insightful discussion today. With this, I thank you, and we conclude this edition of RFE RL Live.